The teacher stood at the front of the classroom, snatched the hot meal right out of my 9-year-old daughter's hands, and tossed it into the trash. She handed her a single slice of dry bread and announced to 24 staring children that some families just love to leech off the system. My daughter came home sobbing, bearing a bright red stamp on her skin that branded her with debt. Weeks later, that same teacher was sitting in the front row of the district assembly waiting to receive her Educator of the Year award. She was expecting the newly appointed district superintendent to hand her the plaque. Her arrogant smile vanished the exact second I walked onto that stage. My name is Valerie Thorne. I am 34 years old. Before I tell you how I systematically dismantled a corrupt administration, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you believe bullies standing in classrooms should face the consequences of their cruelty. It started on a Tuesday afternoon. The yellow school bus hissed to a stop at the end of our street in Oakridge, a manicured suburb where the lawns are flawless and the property taxes are exorbitant. My daughter Maya stepped off the bus. Her small shoulders hunched forward. She did not run to greet me. She kept her head down her chest, heaving with silent, ragged breaths. When she reached the driveway, she collapsed against my legs. I knelt down to hold her, and that is when I saw it. Stamped across the back of her small hand, pressed so hard the red ink bled deep into the creases of her skin, were two glaring words: lunch debt. There was no sealed letter in her backpack. There was no discreet email sent to my inbox. The school allowed a grown woman to physically brand a 9-year-old child. Through heavy sobs, Maya choked out the story of what happened in the cafeteria. Brenda Gallagher, a veteran teacher who treated her classroom like a personal kingdom, had marched up to Maya's table. She did not pull Maya aside. Brenda grabbed the hot tray of chicken and vegetables right out of my daughter's hands and dumped it straight into the garbage bin. The loud crash silenced the entire cafeteria. Brenda then dropped a single piece of stale bread onto the empty table. She turned to face the 24 wide-eyed students and delivered her lesson for the day. She told the class they needed to learn self-reliance because clearly some people in this town expect a free ride and cannot even afford to feed their own kids. The cruelty did not stop there. When Maya sat frozen in her seat, hot tears spilling down her cheeks, Brenda instructed the children sitting next to her to move their trays away. She told them that financial irresponsibility was a bad habit they should not catch. My daughter spent the next 4 hours staring at a white brick wall completely isolated, branded like cattle. We had moved to Oakridge exactly 3 weeks ago. I enrolled Maya under my maiden name as a standard resident. Because of a simple delay in transferring our residency files across county lines, the automated system temporarily flagged Maya's account for subsidized meals. Brenda Gallagher did not call the administration to verify. She saw an opportunity to exert dominance over a new vulnerable student and took it without hesitation. Any other mother might have grabbed her car keys, stormed into the school lobby, and screamed until her lungs gave out. I did not shed a single tear. I did not raise my voice. I took out my phone and captured a high-resolution photograph of the red ink staining Maya's hand. I documented the slight bruising where the stamp had been slammed against her fragile bones. I was not preparing for a screaming match. I was gathering my receipts. The next morning, I parked my car in the visitor lot of Oakridge Elementary School. The building was a sprawling fortress of red brick and manicured hedges, deliberately designed to project an image of pristine educational excellence. Parents driving imported luxury vehicles dropped off their children at the front curb, exchanging bright, hollow greetings across the pavement. The entire campus smelled of fresh landscaping and misplaced priorities. I walked through the heavy double-glass doors and approached the main reception desk. The administrative assistant did not bother to look up from her monitor. She kept typing for a full minute before sliding a visitor log across the polished counter with a manicured finger. I picked up the pen and wrote my name in steady, even strokes. I did not ask for an appointment. I simply stated that Principal Richard Caldwell needed to see me immediately regarding an incident in Brenda Gallagher's classroom. The secretary picked up her phone, murmured a few hushed words into the receiver, and pointed her pen toward the heavy oak door at the far end of the corridor. When I turned the brass handle and stepped inside, I realized instantly that this was not a meeting. It was a calculated ambush. The layout of the office was a masterclass in spatial intimidation. Principal Richard Caldwell sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his legs crossed casually, his suit jacket draped lazily over the back of his leather chair. Brenda Gallagher stood to his right like a personal guard, her arms folded tightly across her chest, wearing a smug, rehearsed smirk that failed to reach her cold eyes. But they were not alone. Sitting on the tufted leather sofa near the window was Sylvia. Sylvia served as the reigning president of the Oakridge Parent-Teacher Association. She held a designer handbag on her lap and looked at me with the distinct evaluating gaze of a woman inspecting a dirty stain on her expensive rug. I did not take the empty guest chair positioned in front of the desk. I stood in the center of the room and placed my phone directly onto the polished surface of Richard Caldwell's desk. The screen was illuminated, displaying the high-resolution photograph of Maya's bruised hand. The red ink of the debt stamp glared against her pale skin, an undeniable brand of humiliation. I stated the facts cleanly, stripping away any emotion from my voice. I detailed how Brenda snatched the hot tray, threw the food into the garbage, and branded a 9-year-old child over a clerical error regarding lunch balances. Richard leaned forward, but his eyes never even flicked toward the photograph. He looked at me, offering a patronizing sigh that sounded like a tire slowly losing air. He steepled his fingers together and adopted the practiced, soothing tone of a politician handling a minor public relations annoyance. He told me that Brenda Gallagher was a 20-year veteran of the Oakridge district. He called her an institution, a pillar of the community who had shaped countless successful minds. Then he tilted his head and suggested that perhaps I was overreacting to a standard disciplinary measure. He used the word misunderstanding twice. He implied that my daughter might have exaggerated the cafeteria exchange to gain sympathy from a busy mother. Before I could address his blatant dismissal, Sylvia uncrossed her legs and sighed loudly from the sofa. She adjusted her posture, ensuring the gold clasp of her handbag caught the morning light filtering through the blinds. She spoke with a slow, deliberate drawl, treating every syllable like a condescending lecture on economics. Sylvia informed me that Oakridge was not like other districts. She bragged about the exorbitant property taxes the residents paid to maintain their elite academic standards. She said the parents here valued financial accountability above all else. Then she looked me up and down, taking inventory of my plain gray blazer and sensible shoes. Sylvia stated that the community was simply not accustomed to new, single mothers moving in and immediately demanding special privileges while failing to meet their basic financial obligations. She framed my daughter's public humiliation not as cruelty, but as a necessary lesson in civic duty for the less fortunate. The coordinated attack was seamless. They played their parts flawlessly. Richard provided the institutional shield, Sylvia delivered the class-based insult, and Brenda stepped forward to deliver the final brutal strike. Brenda picked up a clipboard from the edge of the desk. She slid a single sheet of paper across the mahogany surface toward me. The bold letters at the top of the page read, "Financial Hardship and Charity Relief Application." Brenda's smirk softened into a mask of weaponized pity. She leaned over the desk, invading my personal space, and spoke in a hushed, sympathetic tone that made my skin crawl. She told me there was no shame in admitting defeat. She said the faculty understood that broken homes often struggled to keep the lights on and put food on the table. She urged me to fill out the charity form so the PTA could organize a canned food drive for my kitchen pantry. She wanted me to sign a document admitting poverty, admitting negligence, admitting that I was less than human, all in exchange for a hot meal for my child. She looked at me with wide, fake eyes, waiting for me to take the pen and sign away my dignity. The air in the principal's office grew thick and suffocating. The walls seemed to press inward, shrinking the room by the second. The combined weight of their arrogance, their coordinated bullying, and their utter disregard for a child's dignity formed a heavy, invisible pressure against my chest. They stood there, 3 powerful figures in a wealthy suburban school, smiling at what they believed was a cornered, helpless target. They expected me to break. They expected me to drop my gaze, grab the charity relief application with trembling hands, and walk out of that room consumed by shame. They wanted to strip away my pride until there was nothing left but silent submission. That suffocating sensation, that exact metallic taste of bile rising in the back of my throat was not a new feeling. It was a phantom ache, an old wound tearing open without warning. As I looked down at the humiliating charity form resting on the desk, the polished mahogany wood seemed to dissolve before my eyes. The smug, triumphant faces of Richard, Brenda, and Sylvia faded into a dark, spinning blur. The sterile, air-conditioned smell of the school office was suddenly replaced by the scent of cheap floor wax, stale cigarette smoke, and bitter coffee. My mind violently jerked backward, pulling me away from the wealthy, manicured suburb of Oakridge and plunging me deep into a memory I had spent years trying to bury. I was no longer standing in a tailored blazer holding a smartphone. The heavy, crushing weight of their intimidation triggered a visceral shift in my reality, transporting me straight back to a different office, a different desk, and a different cruel face staring down at me. I felt the familiar, terrifying chill of being 22 years old, standing in worn-out waitress shoes, clutching a sleeping toddler to my chest, while the entire world collapsed around me. The feeling of being completely powerless wrapped around my throat like a vice, dragging my consciousness into the dark shadows of 7 years ago. The sterile scent of the Oakridge principal's office vanished, replaced instantly by the harsh chemical smell of cheap floor wax and old coffee. The mahogany desk in front of me morphed into a scratched metal table. The year was 7 years ago. The city was Chicago. The bitter winter wind rattled the thin glass of the window panes, and I was 22 years old, standing in my grease-stained waitress uniform with my heart pounding against my ribs. I was exhausted, running on 3 hours of sleep, clutching the straps of my worn canvas tote bag. My daughter Maya was just 2 years old, sitting quietly in a plastic chair in the corner of a dreary daycare administration office. Sitting across from me was Director Harrison, a mid-level bureaucrat who wielded his minor authority like a weapon against the desperate and the tired. I owed the facility a supplementary supply fee of $50. $50. That was the exact cost of my dignity that day. I had brought $30 in crumpled bills and quarters, begging him for an extension until my Friday paycheck cleared. I explained that my night shifts at the diner had been cut short that week. I pleaded with him, explaining that if Maya lost her daycare spot, I would lose my job, and if I lost my job, we would lose our apartment. Director Harrison did not look at me with sympathy. He looked at me with the exact same expression Sylvia and Brenda were wearing right now. Disgust mixed with a thrilling sense of superiority. He opened a manila folder and pulled out a state-issued form. He tapped his pen against the paper and informed me that my inability to provide basic financial stability for my child constituted grounds for a formal report. He threatened to call Child Protective Services. He told me that a mother who could not pay a $50 fee was clearly an unfit guardian. He used the law, the system, and a piece of paper to hold a knife to my throat. I broke down. I stood in that miserable office and wept. I let the tears spill over my cheeks, staining the collar of my cheap uniform. I begged him. I swallowed every ounce of pride I possessed and pleaded for mercy from a man who fed on the humiliation of others. He smiled a tight, triumphant smile, granted me a 3-day extension, and warned me that I was on his permanent watch list. I scooped Maya into my arms and walked out into the freezing Chicago evening. The icy wind hit my wet face like shattered glass. I stood on the sidewalk shivering in a thin coat, holding my toddler against my chest to keep her warm. As the cold bit into my skin, the tears stopped falling. The panic drained out of my veins, leaving behind a hollow, freezing emptiness. In that emptiness, a spark ignited. It was a promise forged in the bitter cold of complete powerlessness. I swore to myself right there on the concrete that I would never again allow anyone sitting behind a desk to use a piece of paper to threaten my family. I would never again be the victim of a system I did not understand. I would learn their rules, master their language, and I would learn how to tear their institutions apart from the inside out. The next 7 years were not a story of slow healing. They were a relentless, grueling march through the trenches of academia and corporate finance. I did not just survive. I weaponized my exhaustion. I worked my diner shifts until 2 a.m, then sat at the sticky laminate counter under flickering fluorescent lights, drinking black coffee and devouring textbooks. I applied for every grant, every scholarship, and every student loan available. I learned the intricate, boring, and highly lethal language of bureaucratic policy. I earned my bachelor's degree while holding Maya on my lap during lectures. I went straight into a master's program in educational administration. I stopped begging for extensions and started reading municipal budgets. I learned how public funds flowed from state treasuries into district coffers. I learned how administrators hid their theft behind discretionary spending lines and phantom vendor contracts. I realized that the people who terrorized vulnerable parents were usually the same people stealing from the taxpayers. I pushed harder. I earned my doctorate in educational leadership. I became Dr. Valerie Thorne. The frightened waitress died, replaced by a forensic auditor who specialized in school district compliance. I was hired by state oversight committees to hunt down corruption in failing school systems. I walked into administration buildings across the Midwest, armed with ledgers and legal statutes, and I dismantled the careers of men and women who thought they were untouchable. I fired embezzlers. I reported fraudulent principals to the authorities. I learned that tears are useless against tyrants, but an audit report showing missing funds is a guillotine. The desperation I felt in Chicago had been placed on an anvil and hammered into the cold precision of a scalpel. The vivid memory snapped shut. The spinning sensation stopped, dropping me back into the present moment inside the lavish Oakridge elementary office. The transition was seamless. I was no longer shivering on a Chicago sidewalk. I was standing in a tailored gray blazer, my posture rigid, my breathing perfectly controlled. I looked down at the mahogany desk. The financial hardship and charity relief application still sat there waiting for my signature. Brenda Gallagher was still leaning forward, her face twisted into a mask of fake concern, expecting me to pick up the pen. Sylvia was still watching from the leather sofa, waiting for the entertaining spectacle of a poor mother surrendering her dignity. Principal Richard Caldwell still had his fingers steepled together, confident that he had successfully neutralized a potential problem. They thought they had orchestrated a brilliant psychological ambush. They thought they had backed a helpless single mother into a corner. They had no idea that the woman standing in front of them had spent the last 7 years destroying people exactly like them for a living. They did not know that by trying to humiliate me, they had just handed the state's most aggressive educational auditor a personalized invitation to inspect their territory. I did not reach for the pen. I did not break eye contact. I looked at Brenda first, studying the arrogant tilt of her chin. Then my gaze shifted to Sylvia, taking in the designer handbag she used as a shield. Finally, I looked directly into Richard Caldwell's eyes. I let the silence stretch out, allowing the heavy tension in the room to shift entirely onto their shoulders. The smug smiles on their faces began to falter just slightly as they realized I was not shrinking under their gaze. I reached out and placed my index finger on the charity form. I slowly pushed the piece of paper back across the polished mahogany, sliding it until it rested directly in front of Brenda. My voice was low, steady, and entirely devoid of the fear they expected to hear. I told them I would not be signing their form today or any other day. Brenda blinked, her fake sympathy dropping instantly into sharp annoyance. She straightened up, crossing her arms defensively. She asked me if I understood that without the charity relief, Maya would continue to face the district's strict debt collection policies. She used the word strict as a thinly veiled threat. I picked up my smartphone from the desk. I looked at the three of them one last time, memorizing their faces, cataloging their arrogance for later use. I told Brenda that I understood Oakridge policies perfectly. I added that I was very much looking forward to seeing how strictly those policies held up under scrutiny. I turned my back on the principal, the PTA president, and the veteran teacher, and I walked out of the office. My heels clicked against the hardwood floor with a steady, rhythmic cadence. I did not slam the door behind me. I pulled it shut with a quiet, deliberate click. I left them sitting in their pristine office, completely unaware that the countdown to their administrative execution had just begun. My calm departure from the principal's office did not diffuse the situation. It ignited a vicious sense of retaliation inside Brenda Gallagher. Bullies who thrive on power are deeply unsettled by targets who refuse to cower. Because I did not cry, beg, or sign her humiliating charity form, Brenda decided she needed to make a public example out of my family. She needed an audience to reestablish her dominance. The very next afternoon, I stood on the crowded sidewalk outside the school's main entrance, waiting for the dismissal bell. The area was packed with Oakridge parents chatting near their idling SUVs. The heavy doors swung open, and a flood of children poured out. I spotted Maya navigating her way through the crowd, her backpack slung over one shoulder. Before she could reach me, Brenda's sharp voice cut through the noise of the courtyard. She called out Maya's name loudly enough to stop the conversations of at least a dozen nearby parents. Heads turned, eyes locked onto my daughter. Brenda marched down the concrete steps, holding a bulky plastic shopping bag. She approached Maya, plastered a look of theatrical sorrow across her face, and pulled a garment from the bag. It was a winter coat, not a gently used donation, but a heavily worn, deeply stained mustard yellow jacket with frayed cuffs and a broken zipper. Brenda shoved the filthy coat into Maya's small hands. She projected her voice, ensuring every parent within a 20-foot radius heard her declaration. She told my daughter not to feel ashamed of her mother's financial struggles. She announced that the faculty had pooled their resources because they simply could not stand by and watch a child suffer the consequences of an empty bank account. She patted Maya on the shoulder, looked directly at me through the crowd, and offered a condescending, victorious smile. Maya stood frozen on the sidewalk, clutching the stained coat to her chest, her face burning crimson as the murmurs of the surrounding parents washed over her. The humiliation was absolute, precise, and entirely orchestrated. It was a performance designed to brand me as a negligent mother and my daughter as a charity case in front of the entire community. I did not storm the steps. I did not rip the coat from Brenda's hands and throw it in her face. The heat of fury flared in my chest, a sudden blinding urge to tear that smug look off the teacher's face, but I forced it down. Reacting with anger would only validate her narrative. It would give Sylvia and the PTA exactly what they wanted: the loud, unstable, low-income mother losing her temper on school grounds. I walked forward calmly. I took the mustard yellow coat from Maya's hands, folded it over my arm without looking at it, and took my daughter's hand. I looked at Brenda, offered a tight, polite nod that contained absolutely no gratitude, and walked Maya to our car in complete silence. I did not speak until we were safely inside the vehicle with the doors locked. I promised Maya that she would never have to wear that coat. I promised her that things were going to change very soon. Later that evening, my sister Jessica and her husband Marcus came over for our routine Thursday night dinner. Marcus is a sharp, fiercely intelligent African-American forensic accountant who specializes in uncovering corporate fraud. He works for a high-tier financial consulting firm in downtown Chicago, and his mind operates like a steel trap. He spends his days dismantling shell companies and tracing hidden assets for federal investigations. He is the kind of man who looks at a spreadsheet and sees a crime scene. After dinner, while Jessica and Maya were in the living room putting together a puzzle, I sat at the kitchen island with Marcus. I poured him a cup of coffee and slid a crumpled piece of paper across the granite countertop. It was a debt collection notice that Brenda had intentionally slipped into the pocket of the stained winter coat. The document detailed Maya's outstanding lunch balance. The principal amount was exactly $14. Marcus picked up the paper, expecting a standard district invoice. He adjusted his glasses, scanned the text, and took a sip of his coffee. Then he stopped. He lowered his mug slowly and pulled the paper closer to his face. His brow furrowed as his eyes locked onto a block of fine print buried at the very bottom of the page. He tapped his index finger against the paper and looked up at me. He pointed out a glaring irregularity. The collection notice did not direct the parent to submit payment to the Oakridge School District Treasury. It did not provide a routing number for the County Board of Education. Instead, the document explicitly mandated that all outstanding lunch debts had to be cleared through an independent third-party online portal called EduPay Solutions. Marcus slid the paper back to me and pointed to a specific line item. He explained that EduPay Solutions was not just processing the $14 debt. The portal was automatically tacking on a mandatory, non-refundable 15% administrative processing fee to every single transaction. The pieces of the puzzle began to violently shift. A spark of pure cold clarity ignited in my mind. This was not just a case of a mean-spirited teacher bullying a new student over a missed payment. A public school district routing minor student debts through a private, fee-heavy payment portal was a massive red flag. The exorbitant 15% surcharge was not going into the school's budget to buy new textbooks or fund field trips. That money was bleeding out of the district and flowing directly into the pockets of a private entity. I looked at Marcus, and he looked back at me with the exact same realization dawning in his eyes. The dynamic of the conflict had just instantly evolved. I was no longer dealing with a localized case of schoolyard harassment or toxic suburban elitism. The bullying, the public shaming the red stamp on my daughter's hand, these were not just acts of cruelty, they were enforcement tactics. They were aggressive collection methods designed to terrify parents into quickly swiping their credit cards through a predatory system to avoid public humiliation. The layer of polished, affluent respectability that coated Oakridge Elementary was beginning to peel away, revealing the rotten, corrupt foundation underneath. Brenda Gallagher and Richard Caldwell were not just elitist educators. They were running a highly organized financial extortion ring, using the children as leverage and the parents' fear of social ostracization as the primary driving force. The conflict had just escalated from psychological abuse to a sophisticated financial crime. The retaliation did not stay confined within the brick walls of the elementary school. Brenda Gallagher and Sylvia understood that in a wealthy suburban enclave like Oakridge, social currency dictated survival. They intended to bankrupt my reputation before I could pose a legitimate threat to their authority. They initiated a coordinated whisper campaign designed to isolate my daughter and me from the rest of the community. Sylvia utilized her position as the Parent-Teacher Association president to weaponize the official Oakridge Parents social media forum. I had created a silent profile during our first week in town, which allowed me to monitor the digital assault in real time. Sylvia drafted long, thinly veiled posts about the importance of maintaining high neighborhood standards. She lamented the burden placed on hardworking taxpayers when transient families move into the district and expect handouts. She never typed my name. She did not have to. Brenda provided validating comments beneath every post, expressing her deep, rehearsed sorrow over the difficulty of teaching children who lacked basic parental support and financial discipline at home. The suburban echo chamber performed its function flawlessly. The ostracization materialized immediately in my daily life. When I walked down the aisles of the local grocery store, animated conversations between other mothers abruptly stopped. Women I had politely greeted just days earlier would pivot their shopping carts and examine canned goods to avoid making eye contact. They treated my family like a contagion that might infect their pristine neighborhood. Then Brenda redirected her focus back to Maya, striking her in the one area where my daughter truly thrived. Maya had dedicated 3 long weeks to building a miniature solar-powered rover for the upcoming Oakridge Science Fair. She had painted the tiny cardboard chassis bright blue and wired the delicate solar panels using a beginner electronics kit. She was intensely proud of her creation. On a Wednesday afternoon, Maya trudged up our driveway with her shoulders slumped, carrying the heavy cardboard display board in her arms. Brenda had crossed Maya's name off the official exhibition roster. The justification provided on a pink slip of paper tucked into Maya's backpack was a failure to pay the annual Science Department activity dues by the Friday deadline. The fee was $20. Brenda was fully aware that our account was under an administrative hold due to the residency transfer, but she seized the technicality to deliver a crushing blow to a 9-year-old child. Brenda wanted to break my daughter's academic spirit to force my compliance. I took the heavy cardboard box from Maya's hands and placed it carefully on the kitchen counter. I looked at the intricate wiring my daughter had built. I promised Maya that her rover would sit on a display table very soon. I did not shed a tear. I simply converted the pain of watching my child suffer into raw, focused energy for the task ahead. While Brenda and Sylvia busied themselves with petty social warfare, they remained entirely oblivious to the lethal machinery operating inside my house. They believed they were dealing with a helpless, overwhelmed single mother who would eventually buckle under the weight of suburban peer pressure. They did not realize they had handed a thread to Marcus. Marcus does not sleep when a ledger refuses to balance. After putting his own children to bed, my brother-in-law arrived at my front door with a leather briefcase and a large thermos of dark roast coffee. He walked straight into my dining room, commandeered the large oak table, and opened his laptop. Marcus connected to a secure financial database and began tearing apart the corporate structure of EduPay Solutions. I sat across from him reviewing the school board's publicly available budget reports while the pale glow of the monitor illuminated his face. The petty drama of the Oakridge PTA faded into the background, replaced by the cold, undeniable logic of forensic accounting. Marcus worked in total silence through the night. He traced limited liability corporation registrations across multiple state lines. He pulled tax identification numbers and cross-referenced them with local business permits. He mapped the exact flow of the money. The Oakridge School District mandated that all parents use EduPay solutions to clear cafeteria balances, fund field trips, and pay extracurricular club dues. Every single transaction processed through that specific portal incurred a mandatory 15% administrative surcharge. For a sprawling school district serving over 4,000 affluent students, those daily microtransactions generated a staggering river of cash. Parents paying $50 for a field trip were losing $7.50 to a processing fee. Parents paying $100 for semester supplies lost $15. When multiplied by thousands of transactions a month, the numbers transformed into a highly lucrative enterprise. Marcus followed that river of stolen cash to its final destination. By 6 a.m, the sky outside my dining room window turned a pale, icy blue. Marcus closed his laptop with a quiet, definitive click. He gathered a stack of freshly printed documents from my home office printer and slid them across the wooden table toward me. He took a sip of his lukewarm coffee and delivered the facts with the clinical precision of a seasoned investigator. EduPay Solutions was not a legitimate financial technology firm. It was a ghost entity. Marcus had uncovered the original articles of incorporation buried in a neighboring state's registry. The registered owner of the payment portal was a man named Greg Peterson. Marcus placed a printed social media photograph on the table. The image showed Brenda Gallagher smiling brightly at a summer barbecue, standing shoulder to shoulder with her sister and her brother-in-law, Greg Peterson. Brenda had secured a monopoly on the school's financial transactions and routed the processing fees directly into her own family's bank accounts. But Marcus had not stopped there. A teacher running a localized financial grift required high-level administrative protection to enforce compliance among the student body. He had dug deep into the corporate board registry for EduPay Solutions. The company listed 3 board members. 2 of the seats were occupied by empty holding companies designed to obscure ownership. The 3rd seat belonged to a silent partner listed under a blinded trust. Marcus utilized his firm's proprietary tracing software to pierce the veil of that trust. He slid the final damning piece of paper across the table. It was a notarized bank authorization form required to open the hidden trust account. The signature resting at the bottom of the page belonged to Principal Richard Caldwell. The entire chaotic picture snapped into sharp, terrifying focus. The disgust I felt was no longer about a ruined winter coat or a skipped science fair. The conflict had mutated from cruel suburban elitism into a highly organized criminal enterprise. This was a sophisticated extortion ring hiding in plain sight behind the respectable brick walls of Oakridge Elementary. Richard Caldwell and Brenda Gallagher had weaponized the school's billing policies to enrich themselves. They intentionally targeted vulnerable families using the social stigma of lunch debt as an instrument of terror. They humiliated children in front of their peers. They drove parents into a state of sheer panic, forcing mothers and fathers to quickly swipe their credit cards through the EduPay portal just to put an end to the public shaming. The cruelty was not a byproduct of their strict standards. The cruelty was the primary collection mechanism. Every time a terrified mother paid a $14 lunch debt to stop her child from crying, a percentage of that transaction flowed directly into the offshore bank accounts of the principal and his lead enforcer. They were siphoning thousands of dollars a month from the Oakridge community. They used the guise of elite academic rigor to mask pure, unadulterated greed. They relied on the pride of wealthy parents who would rather pay exorbitant hidden fees than question a bill and appear financially unstable. Brenda and Richard believed their system was bulletproof. They believed their authority within the school walls shielded them from outside scrutiny. I gathered the printed documents, aligned the edges of the paper, and placed them into a red folder. The anger in my chest settled into a cold, unbreakable resolve. The audience was about to learn that the most dangerous predators do not hide in dark alleys. They stand at the front of the classroom and demand respect. The opportunity to trap them within their own bureaucratic maze arrived the following week. Oakridge Elementary announced an upcoming field trip to the State Natural History Museum. For my 9-year-old daughter, this was not just an excursion, it was a lifeline. Maya had spent weeks memorizing the names of prehistoric eras, sketching dinosaur, skeletal structures in her notebooks, and reading every library book she could find on paleontology. For a brief moment, the anticipation of the museum visit lifted the heavy, suffocating shadow of her isolation at the back of the classroom. She talked about the dinosaur exhibits during dinner, her eyes holding a faint glimmer of the bright, enthusiastic child she used to be, before Brenda Gallagher decided to break her spirit. That fragile hope did not last. On Wednesday afternoon, Maya walked through the front door with her head bowed, her shoulders tense and rigid. She did not speak. She reached into her backpack, pulled out a crumpled pink permission slip, and placed it silently on the kitchen counter before retreating to her bedroom. I looked down at the paper. The signature line meant for a parent to authorize the trip had been violently crossed out with a thick black marker. Stapled to the top corner of the permission slip was a handwritten note from Brenda. The ink was a glaring, venomous red. The message dictated that Oakridge Elementary enforced a strict policy regarding extracurricular privileges. Any student carrying a negative cafeteria balance exceeding $10 was automatically disqualified from attending off-campus events. The cruelty of the note did not end with the denial of the trip. Brenda had added a second sentence detailing Maya's alternative assignment. While her classmates spent the day exploring the museum, my daughter would be required to report to the school library to serve as an unpaid janitorial assistant, wiping down tables and organizing discarded books. Brenda Gallagher was attempting to punish poverty with manual labor. She was weaponizing a child's excitement, holding the museum trip hostage over a minor administrative fee. But knowing what Marcus had uncovered about the offshore shell company, I saw the pink permission slip for what it truly was. It was not a disciplinary measure. It was an extortion tactic. Brenda was applying maximum emotional pressure to force me into a state of frantic compliance. She expected me to log onto my computer, navigate to the EduPay Solutions portal, and submit my credit card information to clear the $14 debt, thereby feeding their hidden 15% surcharge directly into her brother-in-law's bank account. I decided to give them the exact opposite of what they expected. The next morning, I did not open my laptop. I drove to my local bank branch and walked up to the teller window. I withdrew $14 from my checking account. I requested the currency in specific denominations, 1 crisp $10 bill and 4 crisp $1 bills. I folded the paper money, slipped the cash into the pocket of my gray suit jacket, and drove directly to the sprawling, manicured campus of Oakridge Elementary. I stepped through the heavy glass doors of the administrative building and approached the front reception desk. The main office hummed with the quiet, efficient energy of a well-funded suburban school. The head secretary sat behind a high laminate counter, typing rapidly on her keyboard. I waited until she finished her sentence before I spoke. I kept my voice low, polite, and stripped of any confrontational tone. I stated my name and informed her that I was there to settle the outstanding cafeteria balance for Maya Thorne. I reached into my pocket, withdrew the $14, and placed the crisp bills directly onto the polished surface of the reception counter. I smoothed the paper currency flat with the palm of my hand. The secretary stopped typing. She stared at the cash resting on her desk, as if I had just placed a live insect in front of her keyboard. She blinked, her brow furrowing in genuine confusion. She pushed her chair back slightly and shook her head. She informed me that the front office did not handle physical currency for student accounts. She stated that Oakridge possessed a unified digital ledger and directed me to log into the parent portal to process the payment electronically. I did not reach for the money. I kept my hands folded in front of me and informed her that United States currency is legal tender for all debts, public and private. I stated that the school claimed I owed a debt of $14, and I was providing the exact amount required to clear that ledger. Before the flustered secretary could formulate a response, the door to the adjacent faculty lounge swung open. Brenda Gallagher stepped out into the reception area holding a ceramic coffee mug. She had clearly heard the exchange from behind the door. A smug, triumphant smile spread across her face. She walked over to the reception counter and stood beside the secretary, positioning herself as the ultimate authority in the room. Brenda looked at the $14 resting on the laminate counter, then slowly raised her eyes to meet mine. She let out a soft, condescending sigh. She spoke with a slow, exaggerated cadence, treating me like a slow-witted child who failed to comprehend basic instructions. Brenda declared that Oakridge Elementary adhered to modern, streamlined protocols. She stated that the administration strictly forbade the handling of loose cash to prevent accounting errors. She crossed her arms, the coffee mug resting against her chest, and delivered her ultimatum. She told me that the mandate was clear. The lunch balance had to be routed through the designated online payment gateway. She tilted her head, her smile widening into a mocking grin. She suggested that if I lacked the credit facilities or banking structure necessary to manage a simple digital transaction, then my daughter would simply have to accept the consequences and remain on campus during the museum trip. She was daring me to argue. She was trying to provoke a loud, desperate scene in the middle of the reception area. She wanted me to beg for an exception so she could deny it. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I reached into my other pocket and pulled out my smartphone. I unlocked the screen, opened the camera application, and switched it to video mode. I pressed the red recording icon. I held the phone steady. I panned the camera lens down to clearly capture the crisp $10 bill and the 4 $1 bills resting on the school's reception desk. I slowly raised the camera to frame both the secretary and Brenda Gallagher in the shot. I kept my voice entirely neutral, speaking with the cold, measured diction of an investigator documenting a crime scene. I stated for the recording that I was physically present in the main office of Oakridge Elementary. I stated the date and the exact time. I stated that I was attempting to pay a $14 cafeteria debt owed to the public school district using United States legal tender. I looked directly at the camera lens and then shifted my gaze to Brenda. I asked her to state on the record that the school administration was officially refusing to accept federal currency to settle a student debt and was instead mandating that the payment be routed through a private third-party processing company. Brenda Gallagher's arrogance blinded her to the trap. She did not recognize the precise legal phrasing I was using. She saw the camera and assumed I was just another frustrated, dramatic parent trying to create a viral social media moment. She welcomed the recording. She straightened her posture, looked directly into my phone's camera, and proudly reiterated her stance. She stated clearly on video that Oakridge Elementary refused physical cash and mandated all financial transactions proceed through the EduPay Solutions portal. She had just provided me with recorded, undeniable proof of a public institution forcing citizens into a private, fee-heavy financial funnel. She had just documented her own extortion on video. I pressed the red icon again, stopping the recording. I lowered my phone and slid it back into my pocket. The trap had snapped shut, capturing everything I needed. Brenda smiled, assuming she had won the standoff. She gestured toward the money on the counter and told me to take my cash and leave. I did not touch the money. I left the $14 resting on the laminate surface. I looked Brenda directly in the eyes. I did not show her anger. I showed her the chilling, empty calm of a predator that had just secured its prey. I told her that the law would be executed properly. I turned my back on the teacher and the secretary and walked out of the administrative building. The heavy glass doors sealed shut behind me. Walking away meant Maya would not go to the Natural History Museum. It meant my daughter would spend the day sitting in the quiet library, isolated from her peers, serving a punishment she did not deserve. The thought of her sitting there alone burned like a hot coal in my chest. It was a brutal, agonizing tactical sacrifice. But allowing Brenda to win this minor skirmish was necessary to secure the ironclad evidence required to eradicate the entire corrupt administration. I walked toward my car, knowing that the $14 sitting on that desk would be the most expensive mistake Brenda Gallagher ever made. My refusal to utilize the EduPay Solutions portal stripped Brenda Gallagher of her control. Leaving the $14 in cash on the reception counter was an act of quiet defiance that she simply could not tolerate. By refusing to comply with her mandated financial extortion, I had publicly challenged her authority within the walls of Oakridge Elementary. Bullies like Brenda do not view defiance as a disagreement. They view it as a direct threat to their entire power structure. She realized that shaming my daughter and sending condescending emails were no longer effective tactics. She decided to escalate the conflict to the absolute maximum level. She decided to deploy the most terrifying weapon available to any educator in the United States. On Friday afternoon, the suburban quiet of my neighborhood was broken by the sound of a heavy vehicle pulling into my driveway. I stood by the kitchen window and watched a plain, unmarked sedan park directly behind my car. A woman stepped out carrying a thick clipboard and wearing a lanyard bearing an official state insignia. She walked up the concrete path to my front porch and pressed the doorbell. The sharp chime echoed through the house. I opened the front door. The woman standing on my porch possessed the weary, hardened expression of someone accustomed to walking into nightmares. She introduced herself as an investigator for the Department of Child Protective Services. The air in my chest turned to ice. A CPS investigator arriving unannounced on a Friday afternoon was the ultimate nightmare for any parent. An anonymous report had been filed against me. The investigator read the allegations from her clipboard in a flat, clinical tone. The report claimed that I was actively neglecting my 9-year-old daughter. It stated that Maya was arriving at school malnourished and severely underweight. It alleged that the living conditions inside my home were toxic, unsanitary, and unfit for a minor. The report concluded with a vicious accusation of severe psychological abuse, claiming my daughter exhibited the classic trauma responses of a child living in fear. Brenda Gallagher had filed a malicious fabricated report with a government agency. She had leveraged her position as a mandated reporter to weaponize the state apparatus against my family. She was attempting to use the terrifying threat of having my child removed from my custody to force my submission. She wanted to break me. Maya, who had been sitting on the living room rug reading a book, heard the exchange at the door. When she saw the official badge on the investigator's lanyard, the color drained from her small face. She scrambled to her feet, ran to my side, and buried her face against my hip, letting out a sharp, terrified sob. The trauma of the lunchroom humiliation had already made her fragile. The sudden appearance of a government official pushing their way into our home pushed her over the edge into sheer panic. The fury I felt at that moment was unlike anything I had ever experienced. It was not a hot, explosive anger. It was a cold, absolute rage that settled deep into the marrow of my bones. Brenda Gallagher had crossed the final, unforgivable boundary. She had brought terror into my home and aimed a lethal weapon directly at my right to raise my child. But I did not scream at the investigator. I did not fall to my knees and beg her to believe me. Frantic defensive behavior is often interpreted by investigators as a sign of hidden guilt. The only way to dismantle a fabricated bureaucratic attack is with overwhelming, undeniable evidence. I placed my hand gently on Maya's head, smoothing her hair to comfort her, and stepped back to allow the investigator inside. I invited her into the living room with polite, unwavering calm. I offered her a cup of chamomile tea, which she declined with a suspicious narrowing of her eyes. I did not waste time with defensive explanations. I simply began executing a systematic dismantling of every single allegation written on her clipboard. I invited the investigator into the kitchen. I opened the large stainless steel refrigerator and stepped aside. The shelves were immaculate. They were fully stocked with fresh organic produce, lean proteins, and expensive dairy alternatives. The pantry was lined with healthy snacks and whole grains. There was not a single trace of food insecurity in the entire house. I then walked the investigator down the hall to my home office. I opened a filing cabinet and withdrew a thick manila folder containing Maya's comprehensive medical history. I handed the file to the investigator. The documents included records from our previous pediatrician in Chicago, detailing years of routine wellness checks, perfectly normal growth charts, and a complete absence of any physical or psychological trauma markers. The records were pristine. The investigator slowly flipped through the medical documents, her hardened expression softening into a look of genuine confusion. The reality of my clean, quiet, heavily provisioned home directly contradicted the horrific portrait painted by the anonymous report. She closed the manila folder and looked at me. She stated that while the home environment appeared stable, the school had specifically cited repeated failures to provide basic lunch funds as the primary indicator of severe financial neglect. I had been waiting for that exact sentence. I reached into my pocket and retrieved my smartphone. I opened the video gallery, located the footage I had captured the previous morning in the Oakridge administrative office, and pressed play. I handed the phone to the investigator. The high-definition video played clearly. The camera focused on the crisp $14 resting on the reception counter. Brenda Gallagher's voice echoed from the phone's speaker, arrogantly declaring that Oakridge Elementary refused to accept physical legal tender to settle a cafeteria debt. The recording explicitly captured Brenda, demanding that the payment be routed exclusively through the EduPay Solutions online portal. The investigator watched the video twice. She stared at the screen, listening to the teacher reject cash payment for a school lunch. The confusion on the investigator's face hardened into a sharp, recognizable irritation. She was a professional who spent her days rescuing children from actual devastating abuse. She suddenly realized that her valuable time and the limited resources of the state had been hijacked. She recognized that the anonymous report was not a cry for help for a starving child. It was a petty, malicious act of administrative retaliation orchestrated by an arrogant teacher. The investigator handed my phone back to me. She let out a long, heavy sigh that carried the weight of 100 wasted hours. She clicked her pen flipped to the back of the assessment form on her clipboard and drew a thick diagonal line across the page. She declared the allegations entirely unfounded. She stated clearly that she would be closing the case file immediately upon her return to the office. She apologized for the intrusion, offering a brief, sympathetic glance toward Maya, who was still clutching my leg. The investigator turned and walked out the front door. The heavy, unmarked sedan backed out of my driveway and disappeared down the street. The immediate threat of state intervention vanished with the sound of the fading engine. I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt. I knelt down on the hardwood floor and wrapped my arms tightly around my daughter. Maya buried her face in my shoulder, her small body still trembling from the residual fear. I held her until her breathing slowed and her tears finally stopped. I promised her, whispering fiercely into her ear, that the people who had frightened her would never be allowed near her again. Brenda Gallagher had fired her most devastating weapon. She had tried to leverage the power of the state to destroy my family. The attack had failed completely, but the intent behind it required a scorched earth response. Brenda and Principal Caldwell believed they were operating with absolute impunity. They believed they could terrorize parents and exploit children without ever facing a consequence. They were about to discover that the consequence was already standing inside their district, holding all the receipts. The immediate closure of the CPS investigation sent a shockwave through the Oakridge Administrative Office. Brenda Gallagher's ultimate weapon had misfired spectacularly. The realization that state authorities had dismissed their fabricated allegations did not prompt the teacher or the principal to retreat. It caused them to panic. When corrupt systems face a target they cannot easily break, they abandon subtlety and resort to brute force. Principal Richard Caldwell decided it was time to personally eliminate the threat. On Monday afternoon, I received a blunt, single-sentence email from the Oakridge main office demanding my immediate presence. There was no polite request for a meeting time. It was a summons. I arrived at the administrative building precisely at 3 o'clock. The secretary did not offer me a visitor log or ask me to wait. She simply pointed toward the heavy oak door. When I stepped into the office, the atmosphere was entirely different from our first encounter. The patronizing smiles and fake sympathy were gone. The mask of respectable suburban education had been completely discarded. Principal Richard Caldwell sat behind his massive mahogany desk, his posture rigid and aggressive. Brenda Gallagher stood by the window, her arms crossed tightly, glaring at me with undisguised venom. Richard did not offer me a seat. He did not bother with pleasantries. He placed both hands flat on his desk and leaned forward, his face flushed with anger. He dispensed with the political rhetoric and launched a direct verbal assault. He stated that the presence of a Child Protective Services vehicle parked outside a residence in his district was an unacceptable stain on the pristine reputation of Oakridge Elementary. He ignored the fact that his own staff member had initiated the false report. He framed the mere existence of the investigation as proof that my family was a chaotic, disruptive element. He declared, his voice rising in volume, that the Oakridge community did not tolerate delinquent families who brought scandal into their neighborhoods. He reached into a manila folder resting on his desk and pulled out a single sheet of heavy stock paper. He slid the document forcefully across the polished wood until it rested at the very edge of the desk, directly in front of me. The bold text at the top of the page read, "Voluntary Transfer and Records Release Authorization." Richard Caldwell was attempting to execute an administrative purge. He demanded that I sign the document immediately. He outlined his ultimatum with cold, calculated cruelty. He instructed me to voluntarily withdraw Maya from the elite Oakridge district and transfer her enrollment to a chronically underfunded public school on the struggling east side of the county. He presented the transfer as a generous offer, stating that if I signed the paper, the school board would graciously forgive the outstanding cafeteria debt and waive the accrued administrative fees from the EduPay portal. He leaned back in his leather chair, steepling his fingers together, and delivered the threat that anchored his extortion. He warned me that if I refused to sign the voluntary transfer, he would personally ensure that my daughter's permanent academic record reflected severe disciplinary issues. He threatened to brand a 9-year-old child with a documented history of oppositional defiance and chronic truancy. He stated with absolute certainty that those falsified disciplinary marks would follow Maya through the system, guaranteeing that no reputable school or advanced placement program would ever accept her application in the future. It was a blatant, unapologetic act of coercion. Richard and Brenda realized that I was not intimidated by their social ostracization or their bureaucratic bullying. They recognized that a parent who refused to use their hidden payment portal and successfully deflected a CPS investigation was a massive liability to their offshore revenue stream. They needed to silence me, and they needed to physically remove my family from their territory before I could expose their financial crimes. They were using the threat of destroying my daughter's entire academic future to force my eviction from their district. I looked down at the voluntary transfer document resting on the edge of the mahogany desk. I read the legal jargon outlining the immediate termination of enrollment. I read the clause waiving all rights to future district appeals. I did not feel the familiar sickening panic that used to grip my chest when men in authority threatened my family. The terrified, exhausted 22-year-old waitress who had wept in a Chicago daycare office was completely dead. The woman standing in Richard Caldwell's office felt absolutely nothing but the freezing, razor-sharp clarity of a glacier. I reached out and picked up the heavy stock paper. I held it between my hands for a long moment, allowing the tense silence in the room to stretch until it felt brittle. Richard offered a smug, satisfied nod, assuming I was reading the fine print before capitulating to his demands. Brenda's shoulders relaxed slightly, anticipating her victory. I tightened my grip on the edges of the paper. With a swift, fluid motion, I tore the voluntary transfer document straight down the middle. The sharp, tearing sound echoed loudly in the quiet office. I placed the two severed halves of the paper evenly on top of each other, grabbed the edges again, and ripped them into quarters. I tossed the torn pieces of paper back onto the polished mahogany desk. The shredded fragments scattered across the wood, coming to rest near Richard Caldwell's steepled fingers. I kept my voice perfectly level. I did not raise my pitch or allow a single tremor of emotion to bleed into my words. I looked directly into Richard's eyes and delivered my response. I informed him that I would not be signing his document. I stated clearly that my daughter would not be transferring out of Oakridge Elementary. I told him that we were not going anywhere. Richard's smug expression shattered. The color drained from his face, quickly replaced by a furious, mottled red. He slammed his fist down onto the desk, rattling the pens in his organizer. The carefully maintained facade of the elite educator completely vanished, revealing the desperate, cornered extortionist underneath. He hissed at me, his voice trembling with genuine rage. He promised me that I would deeply regret this display of ignorance. He swore that he would make the rest of my time in his district an absolute nightmare. I did not flinch at his outburst. I looked at the shredded paper on his desk, then offered him a brief, chilling smile that did not reach my eyes. I told him I looked forward to seeing how his administration operated under pressure. I turned and walked out of the principal's office. I left Richard Caldwell standing over the torn remnants of his ultimatum, completely unaware that he had just threatened the one person in the state who held the authority to dismantle his entire career. He believed he was dealing with a stubborn, difficult parent. He had no idea that the executioner had already arrived and the guillotine was already falling. The heavy glass doors of the administrative building swung shut behind me, sealing Richard Caldwell and Brenda Gallagher inside their self-contained empire. I walked across the manicured visitor parking lot, the crisp afternoon air a stark contrast to the suffocating tension I had just left behind. I unlocked my sedan, slid into the driver's seat, and closed the door. The interior of the car was quiet, insulated from the affluent hum of the suburban campus. I did not rest my head against the steering wheel. I did not take a moment to process the adrenaline of the confrontation. The time for observation had officially ended. The time for execution had arrived. I reached forward and pressed the ignition button. The dashboard illuminated, casting a soft blue light across the console. I did not dial a local defense attorney to fight the threatened disciplinary marks on Maya's record. I did not contact an investigative journalist to expose the corrupt payment portal. I engaged the vehicle's Bluetooth system and dialed a direct unlisted number that bypassed every standard municipal switchboard in the county. The phone rang twice before a deep, authoritative voice answered. Mayor's office. Sullivan speaking. I leaned back into the leather seat and spoke with the steady, commanding cadence of a professional who was accustomed to directing state-level operations. Mayor Sullivan, it is Dr. Thorne. The field audit is complete. This is the exact moment the carefully constructed reality of the Oakridge School District fractures. The vulnerable, struggling single mother facing eviction from an elite suburb was a meticulously designed fabrication. 3 months prior, the State Board of Education convened a closed-door emergency session in the Capitol. The board had flagged massive, unexplainable discrepancies in the Oakridge District's discretionary funding reports. Elite suburban districts are rarely scrutinized with the same intensity as failing urban schools, allowing deep-rooted corruption to flourish behind a veneer of high test scores and wealthy parent-teacher associations. The state needed an outsider. They needed a forensic specialist who could bypass the localized political protection that shielded men like Richard Caldwell. The board unanimously appointed me as the incoming district superintendent. My mandate was absolute. I was granted full executive authority to investigate, dismantle, and restructure the administrative hierarchy of the entire Oakridge school system. However, arriving in an official capacity would have immediately triggered a massive cover-up. The principals would have sanitized their ledgers, scrubbed their hard drives, and presented a flawless facade. To catch the rot in the system, I had to experience it from the bottom. I made the strategic decision to relocate to Oakridge a full month before my official inauguration date. I enrolled Maya under my maiden name, establishing myself as an ordinary, undocumented resident. The highly convenient clerical delay that triggered the automated subsidized lunch flag on Maya's account was not a bureaucratic error. It was a deliberate manual override I executed myself using my administrative access credentials. I threw a piece of raw meat into the water to see exactly what kind of predators were swimming in the Oakridge district. Brenda Gallagher and Richard Caldwell took the bait with a level of aggressive greed that exceeded even my worst projections. They did not just expose a flaw in the system, they led me directly to the offshore accounts. Dr. Thorne, Mayor Sullivan replied, his tone shifting from casual greeting to sharp professional focus. I assume from your call that the preliminary findings warrant immediate action. I looked through the windshield at the imposing brick facade of the elementary school. I pictured Richard Caldwell sitting behind his mahogany desk, frantically trying to figure out how to destroy my daughter's academic record. The findings exceed the initial scope of the state's inquiry, I stated clearly. My forensic accountant has successfully mapped the entire financial architecture of the EduPay Solutions portal. The shell company is definitively linked to Brenda Gallagher's immediate family. We have hard documentation proving that Principal Caldwell authorized the banking trusts that funnel the 15% processing surcharge out of the district and into their private accounts. I paused, ensuring the weight of the next sentence landed perfectly. Furthermore, Gallagher weaponized the Department of Child Protective Services, filing a malicious and entirely fabricated report to silence a dissenting parent. The extortion ring is fully operational, and they are using state agencies to enforce compliance. A heavy silence fell over the Bluetooth connection. Mayor Sullivan was a veteran politician who had survived decades of municipal scandals, but the sheer brazenness of the extortion scheme operating inside his premier school district clearly caught him off guard. Extortion, wire fraud, and the abuse of emergency state services. The mayor finally summarized, his voice tight with suppressed anger. You have the verified paper trail. I have the physical routing numbers, the signed authorization forms, and recorded video evidence of the administration refusing federal currency to force parents into their private digital gateway, I confirmed. The legal threshold for federal intervention has been met. Understood, Sullivan said. What is your timeline for the transition of power? The Oakridge District Administration was scheduled to host its grand district-wide faculty assembly that coming Friday. It was an annual, highly publicized event designed to celebrate the district's Achievements Present Awards to veteran staff members and formally introduce the new superintendent to the community. Richard Caldwell and Brenda Gallagher were treating the assembly as a coronation. Brenda had already secured the Educator of the Year nomination through her influence over the PTA. They expected to stand on a brightly lit stage and receive applause from the very parents they were quietly robbing. I placed my hands on the steering wheel. The cold leather grounded me. The district assembly is scheduled for Friday morning in the central auditorium, I told the mayor. I want the transition to occur precisely at 10 o'clock. I need you to coordinate with the county sheriff's department. Ensure that a unit of uniformed officers is stationed discreetly outside the auditorium doors before the opening remarks conclude. You are executing the purge publicly, Sullivan noted. It was not a question. They used public humiliation as a weapon to terrorize children and extort parents, I replied, my voice dropping to a low, lethal register. I intend to dismantle their authority on the exact same stage they built to celebrate it. I want every corrupt administrator in this county to witness exactly what happens when they steal from their own students. The police detail will be waiting in the wings, Mayor Sullivan confirmed. The board stands behind you, Superintendent Thorne. Clean house. The call disconnected. The digital display on my dashboard reverted to the clock. It was a Tuesday afternoon. The countdown to Friday had officially begun. I shifted the car into drive and pulled out of the Oakridge Elementary parking lot. I drove away from the school, leaving the arrogant teacher and the corrupt principal completely unaware that the frightened mother they had just tried to banish from their district was actually the architect of their impending destruction. They thought they controlled the game. They did not know the board had already been flipped. While I quietly coordinated the impending legal strike with the mayor's office, and the State Board of Education, Brenda Gallagher, remained blissfully submerged in her own arrogant delusions. She firmly believed that my refusal to sign the voluntary transfer document was the frantic, illogical flailing of a defeated woman. She assumed that by Friday, the crushing weight of the district's bureaucracy would force me to pack my bags and flee Oakridge. To accelerate my departure, she decided to amplify the psychological torture inflicted upon my daughter. On Wednesday morning, Maya walked into her fourth-grade classroom to find that her desk was missing from its usual pod in the center of the room. Brenda had personally dragged Maya's heavy wooden desk across the linoleum floor, positioning it in the furthest, darkest corner of the classroom, directly adjacent to the supply closet. She had intentionally rotated the desk so that Maya's chair faced the blank cinder block wall, completely cutting off her visual access to the chalkboard, the windows, and her peers. When Maya hesitated at the classroom door, unsure of where to sit, Brenda stopped her lesson and pointed toward the isolated corner. She announced to the 24 listening students that Maya required a specialized learning environment due to a lack of disciplinary structure at home. Brenda officially christened the desk the Island of Reflection. The cruelty was meticulously designed to inflict maximum emotional damage. Brenda explicitly instructed the rest of the class that interacting with Maya, speaking to her during group activities, or even acknowledging her presence was strictly forbidden. She warned the children that insubordination and financial irresponsibility were contagious behaviors, and that anyone caught associating with the student on the Island of Reflection would face immediate punitive consequences. Brenda Gallagher had effectively placed a 9-year-old child in solitary confinement within a crowded public school classroom. She used her authority to turn 24 children into complicit wardens, ensuring that Maya spent 7 hours staring at a blank wall, listening to the muffled sounds of a community she was no longer allowed to join. When Maya returned home that afternoon, the change in her demeanor was profound and deeply alarming. She did not run through the front door in tears, seeking comfort. She did not throw her backpack onto the floor in anger. She walked into the kitchen with a slow, mechanical gait, her posture rigid and her shoulders slumped. When we sat down at the kitchen island for dinner, she pushed her food around her plate with a fork, staring blankly at the granite countertop. I asked her how her day was keeping my voice gentle and encouraging. Maya did not look up. She described the island of reflection in a flat, monotone voice, stripped of all emotion. She recounted how Brenda had ordered the other children to look away when she walked past them in the hallway. She told me that the teacher had ignored her raised hand for the entire day. The tears were gone. The fear was gone. Brenda Gallagher's relentless psychological assault had driven my daughter into a state of profound emotional detachment. Maya had internalized the isolation, pulling her spirit deep inside herself to survive the trauma of being erased by the adults trusted to protect her. Sitting across from my daughter, looking into her hollow, exhausted eyes, I experienced a physical reaction I had not felt in years. The cold, analytical detachment required to perform a state-level audit briefly fractured. A surge of pure, lethal adrenaline flooded my veins, a primal, overwhelming instinct to drive back to that school, kick down the heavy oak doors, and physically drag Brenda Gallagher out of her classroom. The desire to inflict immediate, devastating retaliation burned so hot in my chest that I had to grip the edges of the granite countertop to stop my hands from shaking. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing the violent impulse back down into the dark. Acting on raw anger would jeopardize the entire operation. Screaming at a teacher would reduce me to the stereotype they had meticulously crafted for me. The destruction of Brenda Gallagher and Richard Caldwell had to be absolute, systematic, and legally irreversible. I could not just wound the beast. I had to sever its head entirely. I looked at Maya. I reached across the kitchen island and gently covered her small, still hand with mine. I spoke to her with a quiet, fierce certainty that commanded her attention. I promised her that she would only have to endure that classroom for 2 more days. I swore to her that she would never have to sit facing a blank wall again. Maya looked at me, a flicker of uncertainty breaking through her detached stare. She nodded slowly, choosing to trust the absolute conviction in my voice. Later that evening, long after Maya had fallen asleep, the headlights of a sleek black sedan swept across my living room wall. The heavy knock on my front door signaled the arrival of the final pieces of the puzzle. I opened the door to find Marcus standing on my porch, dressed in a sharp charcoal suit, holding a heavy reinforced cardboard box. He stepped inside, bypassed the living room, and walked directly to my home office. He placed the box onto the center of my desk and removed the lid. Inside rested 5 identical thick dossiers, each bound tightly in heavy red cardstock. Marcus let out a long, weary exhale, loosening his silk tie. He leaned against the edge of the desk and looked at the red binders. He had spent the last 48 hours executing a flawless, deep-dive forensic extraction. He had bypassed firewalls, subpoenaed banking records through secure channels, and meticulously reconstructed the entire illicit financial architecture of the Oakridge School District. I picked up the top dossier and flipped it open. The pages were a devastating roadmap of institutional corruption. Marcus had secured certified copies of the EduPay solutions routing protocols, definitively linking the 15% administrative surcharges directly to the offshore holding accounts controlled by Greg Peterson, Brenda's brother-in-law. He had pulled the blinded trust documents complete with time-stamped digital signatures, verifying Principal Richard Caldwell's active participation and financial compensation within the extortion ring. The dossier included a detailed timeline cross-referencing the automated lunch debt notifications with the corresponding spikes in the mandatory processing fees, proving that the administration intentionally flagged vulnerable families to maximize their illicit revenue. And tucked into the back pocket of the red binder was a USB drive containing the unedited video file of Brenda Gallagher, arrogantly refusing federal currency in the main reception office. The evidence was ironclad. It was not a collection of suspicions or angry parental complaints. It was a rigorous, irrefutable legal indictment bound in red cardstock. It was the administrative equivalent of a loaded weapon. I closed the heavy cover of the dossier and ran my hand over the smooth surface. Marcus watched me, his sharp eyes catching the dangerous, quiet focus settling over my posture. He did not need to ask if I was ready. He had seen me dismantle corrupt boards before, and he recognized the lethal calm that preceded the strike. Brenda Gallagher believed she was the undisputed queen of her classroom, punishing children on her island of reflection, while hiding behind the shield of her affluent community. She had 48 hours left to enjoy her delusion. The trap was set. The evidence was secured. The executioners were already in position. I turned off the lamp in my office, plunging the room into darkness, entirely prepared to let the corrupt system of Oakridge Elementary burn itself to the ground. Thursday evening settled over the quiet suburban streets of Oakridge like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Inside my house, however, the atmosphere was charged with the sharp electric current of impending execution. My sister Jessica arrived shortly after dinner, carrying a garment bag and an expression of focused determination. She did not ask how I was feeling. She understood the stakes, and she knew the woman she was dealing with. She walked straight into my bedroom, hung the garment bag on the closet door, and carefully unzipped it. Inside the bag hung the armor I would wear to war. It was a tailored navy blue wool suit cut with exacting precision, featuring sharp lapels and a silhouette designed to command authority in any boardroom or assembly hall. Resting beneath it was a pair of pointed-toe black stilettos, polished to a flawless mirror-like shine. This was not the practical, muted wardrobe of the struggling single mother I had portrayed for the past month. This was the uniform of the District Superintendent. Jessica set up the ironing board and meticulously pressed every seam of the blazer, ensuring the fabric was immaculate. The rhythmic hiss of the steam iron provided a steady, calming soundtrack to the evening's preparation. I sat on the edge of the bed, reviewing the executive summary in the red dossier one final time, memorizing the account numbers and the precise timeline of the extortion scheme. While I finalized the legal protocols, the affluent, oblivious community of Oakridge was busy celebrating the architects of their own deception. I opened my laptop and navigated to the official Parent-Teacher Association social media page. The forum was a chaotic, churning echo chamber of self-congratulation and toxic elitism. Sylvia had pinned an announcement to the top of the board, eagerly reminding everyone about the district-wide faculty assembly scheduled for the following morning in the central auditorium. Beneath the announcement, Brenda Gallagher had posted a photograph of herself holding a bouquet of expensive flowers, her face plastered with that familiar, arrogant smirk. Her accompanying status update dripped with thinly veiled contempt and theatrical martyrdom. She wrote that she was deeply honored to be receiving the Educator of the Year award from Principal Caldwell. She stated that teaching was a difficult calling, especially when forced to maintain high standards in the face of uncooperative and irresponsible elements. She concluded her post with a venomous, triumphant declaration, stating that truth and discipline always prevail in the end. The comment section beneath her post was a sickening display of blind allegiance. Dozens of parents, the very people whose credit cards were being quietly siphoned by the EduPay portal, showered her with praise. They called her a hero. They called her a pillar of the community. They validated her cruelty, entirely unaware that the woman they were elevating was actively funding her lifestyle through their localized financial extortion. They were busy constructing a massive gilded pedestal for Brenda and Richard, completely ignorant of the fact that they were actually building a scaffold. I stared at the screen, observing the sheer magnitude of their arrogance. The stark contrast between their public celebration and the devastating reality contained within the red dossier resting on my bed pushed the tension in the room to a suffocating peak. They believed they had won. They firmly believed that they had successfully intimidated the quiet, plain-clothed mother into submission, securing their illicit revenue stream and protecting their pristine suburban bubble. They had no concept of the storm that was currently gathering momentum just a few miles away from their manicured lawns. I closed the laptop, cutting off the digital applause. The sudden silence in the bedroom felt heavy, loaded with the promise of the coming dawn. Jessica unplugged the iron, carefully draped the flawless navy suit over the back of an armchair, and turned to look at me. She offered a tight, brief nod of solidarity before quietly letting herself out the front door. The house was completely still. I walked down the short hallway and gently pushed open the door to Maya's bedroom. The room was softly illuminated by the warm, amber glow of a small nightlight resting on the dresser. I stepped quietly across the carpet and stood beside my daughter's bed. Maya was fast asleep, her breathing slow and even. The tension that had rigidified her small shoulders for the past week had finally released in the safety of sleep. Her face was relaxed, free from the hollow, haunted expression she wore while enduring the brutal isolation of the island of reflection. I reached down and carefully adjusted the quilt, pulling the soft fabric up around her shoulders. I lingered there for a long moment, watching the steady rise and fall of her chest. The anger that had burned inside me since the day she stepped off the school bus with a red stamp on her hand had distilled into something far more dangerous. It was no longer a fire. It was a cold, impenetrable void, a complete absence of mercy or hesitation. I whispered a silent promise into the quiet room. I swore to the sleeping child that tomorrow the balance of power would permanently shift. I promised her that when she walked through the doors of Oakridge Elementary again, the atmosphere would be entirely different. The teachers who had turned a blind eye to her suffering would learn the true cost of complicity. The principal who had threatened to destroy her academic future would be escorted out of his own building, and the woman who had snatched food from her hands and banished her to a corner would be publicly, legally, and professionally annihilated. I promised my daughter that by the time the sun set on Friday, not a single educator in the entire district would ever dare to weaponize a free lunch program against a vulnerable child again. I stepped out of the bedroom and pulled the door shut until it clicked. I walked back to my own room, the polished black stilettos and the sharp navy suit waiting for me in the dark. The final hours of the Oakridge administration were ticking away, measured by the quiet ticking of the hallway clock. The executioners were rested, the evidence was bound, and the stage was perfectly set. I lay down, closed my eyes, and slept the deep, untroubled sleep of a woman who knew exactly how the story was going to end. Friday morning broke clear and bright over the Oakridge district. The sprawling central auditorium of the main administrative complex buzzed with the high-frequency energy of a major community event. The massive room was packed to absolute capacity, housing nearly 400 attendees. The entire district faculty was present, occupying the middle sections in neat, orderly rows. The back of the hall was crowded with local officials, administrative staff, and affluent community members who treated the annual assembly more like a social gala than an educational summit. The front rows were designated as the VIP section, roped off with velvet cords. Sylvia sat firmly in the center of the first row, holding court among the elite members of the Parent-Teacher Association. She wore a tailored linen dress and projected the aura of a woman who personally financed the entire school system. Sitting directly to her right, occupying the seat of honor, was Brenda Gallagher. Brenda had dressed for a coronation. She wore an expensive designer silk dress that clearly exceeded the budget of a standard public school teacher's salary. She sat with her back straight, her chin elevated, soaking in the admiring glances and congratulatory nods from the surrounding parents. She was basking in the absolute certainty of her impending victory. In her mind, she had successfully crushed the defiant, impoverished mother, secured her brother-in-law's lucrative payment portal, and was now minutes away from being officially crowned Educator of the Year. On the brightly lit stage, standing behind a polished wooden podium, was Principal Richard Caldwell. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning into the microphone, delivering his keynote address with the practiced, booming cadence of a megachurch pastor. The heavy red velvet curtains draped behind him added a theatrical weight to his performance. His speech was a masterclass in aggressive hypocrisy. He spoke passionately about the sacred trust between educators and the community. His voice echoed through the massive auditorium as he lectured the 400 attendees on the foundational importance of maintaining unwavering integrity in the classroom. He declared that Oakridge Elementary stood as a shining beacon of moral and academic excellence, a fortress protecting the future of their children from the declining standards of the outside world. He gestured broadly, encompassing the VIP section, and praised the tireless dedication of the veteran teachers who upheld those rigorous standards no matter the cost. It was a brilliant, sickening performance delivered by a man actively funneling thousands of dollars from the parents applauding him. I did not enter the auditorium through the discreet side doors reserved for late arrivals. I did not slip quietly into the back row to observe from the shadows. I waited until Richard hit the emotional crescendo of his speech, his voice soaring as he praised the district's unyielding commitment to financial responsibility. Then I pushed open the heavy main double doors at the absolute rear of the auditorium. The heavy brass latches clicked loudly, the sound echoing sharply against the back wall. I stepped into the center aisle. I was no longer the exhausted, unassuming woman in the sensible shoes and the plain gray blazer. I wore the impeccably tailored navy blue suit, the fabric cutting a sharp, uncompromising silhouette against the bright lights of the hall. The polished black stilettos clicked against the hardwood floor with a steady, lethal rhythm. Every step was deliberate, carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute executive authority. I did not look left or right. I kept my gaze locked dead ahead, aimed directly at the podium where Richard Caldwell stood. The disruption was immediate. The people seated in the back rows turned around expecting to see a lost parent or an administrative assistant delivering a message. When they saw me striding down the center aisle with the focused intensity of an advancing storm, the polite, attentive silence of the auditorium began to fracture. A low murmur started in the back and quickly rippled forward, moving row by row, like a wave over the audience. Whispers broke out among the faculty. Teachers leaned toward one another, confused by the sudden powerful presence interrupting their principal's keynote address. The rhythmic clicking of my heels grew louder as I crossed the midpoint of the massive hall, approaching the velvet ropes of the VIP section. Sylvia, seated in the front row, heard the rising commotion behind her. She turned her head, her annoyance visible, ready to glare at whoever was disrupting the assembly. Her eyes locked onto me. The irritation on her face instantly dissolved, replaced by a profound, jarring confusion. She recognized the face of the poor, struggling mother she had sneered at in the principal's office, but her brain could not reconcile that identity with the commanding, immaculate figure currently marching down the aisle and owning the entire room. Sylvia aggressively nudged Brenda's arm, leaning in to urgently whisper in the teacher's ear. Brenda let out an exasperated sigh and turned around in her seat. The smug, triumphant smile she had worn all morning was permanently affixed to her face as she looked back. The exact second her eyes met mine, that smile died. It did not fade slowly. It was instantly extinguished, wiped from her features, as if struck by a physical blow. The color drained completely from Brenda's face, leaving her skin a stark, sickly white against the expensive collar of her silk dress. Her eyes widened, filling with a sudden, frantic panic. She recognized that the woman walking toward her was not carrying a charity application, and she was not there to beg. Brenda's panic overrode her situational awareness. She jumped up from her VIP seat, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, her voice shrill and desperate as it cut through the murmuring crowd. She frantically signaled to a security guard standing near the side exit, demanding that he immediately remove the disruptive, indebted parent from the prestigious assembly. Up on the stage, the sudden commotion completely derailed Richard Caldwell's soaring speech. He faltered mid-sentence, his booming voice cutting out as he pulled back from the microphone. He gripped the edges of the podium, his brow furrowing in deep, angry confusion as he peered past the stage lights. He saw the chaotic scene unfolding in the VIP section, saw Brenda standing and pointing, and finally traced the source of the disruption to the center aisle. He saw me walking relentlessly toward the stage, stopping exactly at the boundary of the velvet ropes. The entire auditorium of 400 people held its collective breath, the heavy silence amplifying the violent collision between their carefully constructed illusion and the devastating reality that had just arrived to tear it down. Friday morning broke clear and bright over the Oakridge district. The sprawling central auditorium of the main administrative complex buzzed with the high-frequency energy of a major community event. The massive room was packed to absolute capacity, housing nearly 400 attendees. The entire district faculty was present, occupying the middle sections in neat, orderly rows. The back of the hall was crowded with local officials, administrative staff, and affluent community members who treated the annual assembly more like a social gala than an educational summit. The front rows were designated as the VIP section, roped off with velvet cords. Sylvia sat firmly in the center of the first row, holding court, among the elite members of the Parent-Teacher Association. She wore a tailored linen dress and projected the aura of a woman who personally financed the entire school system. Sitting directly to her right, occupying the seat of honor, was Brenda Gallagher. Brenda had dressed for a coronation. She wore an expensive designer silk dress that clearly exceeded the budget of a standard public school teacher's salary. She sat with her back straight, her chin elevated, soaking in the admiring glances and congratulatory nods from the surrounding parents. She was basking in the absolute certainty of her impending victory. In her mind, she had successfully crushed the defiant, impoverished mother, secured her brother-in-law's lucrative payment portal, and was now minutes away from being officially crowned Educator of the Year. On the brightly lit stage, standing behind a polished wooden podium, was Principal Richard Caldwell. He gripped the edges of the podium, leaning into the microphone, delivering his keynote address with the practiced, booming cadence of a megachurch pastor. The heavy red velvet curtains draped behind him added a theatrical weight to his performance. His speech was a masterclass in aggressive hypocrisy. He spoke passionately about the sacred trust between educators and the community. His voice echoed through the massive auditorium as he lectured the 400 attendees on the foundational importance of maintaining unwavering integrity in the classroom. He declared that Oakridge Elementary stood as a shining beacon of moral and academic excellence, a fortress protecting the future of their children from the declining standards of the outside world. He gestured broadly, encompassing the VIP section, and praised the tireless dedication of the veteran teachers who upheld those rigorous standards no matter the cost. It was a brilliant, sickening performance, delivered by a man actively funneling thousands of dollars from the parents applauding him. I did not enter the auditorium through the discreet side doors reserved for late arrivals. I did not slip quietly into the back row to observe from the shadows. I waited until Richard hit the emotional crescendo of his speech, his voice soaring as he praised the district's unyielding commitment to financial responsibility. Then I pushed open the heavy main double doors at the absolute rear of the auditorium. The heavy brass latches clicked loudly, the sound echoing sharply against the back wall. I stepped into the center aisle. I was no longer the exhausted, unassuming woman in the sensible shoes and the plain gray blazer. I wore the impeccably tailored navy blue suit, the fabric cutting a sharp, uncompromising silhouette against the bright lights of the hall. The polished black stilettos clicked against the hardwood floor with a steady, lethal rhythm. Every step was deliberate, carrying the heavy, undeniable weight of absolute executive authority. I did not look left or right. I kept my gaze locked dead ahead, aimed directly at the podium where Richard Caldwell stood. The disruption was immediate. The people seated in the back rows turned around expecting to see a lost parent or an administrative assistant delivering a message. When they saw me striding down the center aisle with the focused intensity of an advancing storm, the polite, attentive silence of the auditorium began to fracture. A low murmur started in the back and quickly rippled forward, moving row by row like a wave over the audience. Whispers broke out among the faculty. Teachers leaned toward one another, confused by the sudden, powerful presence interrupting their principal's keynote address. The rhythmic clicking of my heels grew louder as I crossed the midpoint of the massive hall, approaching the velvet ropes of the VIP section. Sylvia, seated in the front row, heard the rising commotion behind her. She turned her head, her annoyance visible, ready to glare at whoever was disrupting the assembly. Her eyes locked onto me. The irritation on her face instantly dissolved, replaced by a profound, jarring confusion. She recognized the face of the poor, struggling mother she had sneered at in the principal's office, but her brain could not reconcile that identity with the commanding, immaculate figure currently marching down the aisle and owning the entire room. Sylvia aggressively nudged Brenda's arm, leaning in to urgently whisper in the teacher's ear. Brenda let out an exasperated sigh and turned around in her seat. The smug, triumphant smile she had worn all morning was permanently affixed to her face as she looked back. The exact second her eyes met mine, that smile died. It did not fade slowly. It was instantly extinguished, wiped from her features as if struck by a physical blow. The color drained completely from Brenda's face, leaving her skin a stark, sickly white against the expensive collar of her silk dress. Her eyes widened, filling with a sudden, frantic panic. She recognized that the woman walking toward her was not carrying a charity application, and she was not there to beg. Brenda's panic overrode her situational awareness. She jumped up from her VIP seat, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She pointed a trembling finger directly at me, her voice shrill and desperate as it cut through the murmuring crowd. She frantically signaled to a security guard standing near the side exit, demanding that he immediately remove the disruptive indebted parent from the prestigious assembly. Up on the stage, the sudden commotion completely derailed Richard Caldwell's soaring speech. He faltered mid-sentence, his booming voice cutting out as he pulled back from the microphone. He gripped the edges of the podium, his brow furrowing in deep, angry confusion as he peered past the stage lights. He saw the chaotic scene unfolding in the VIP section, saw Brenda standing and pointing, and finally traced the source of the disruption to the center aisle. He saw me walking relentlessly toward the stage, stopping exactly at the boundary of the velvet ropes. The entire auditorium of 400 people held its collective breath, the heavy silence amplifying the violent collision between their carefully constructed illusion and the devastating reality that had just arrived to tear it down. Brenda Gallagher did not wait for the security guard to respond to her frantic gestures. Driven by the sheer desperate need to protect her territory, she pushed past Sylvia and stepped directly into the center aisle, physically blocking my path. She positioned her body defensively, crossing her arms over her expensive silk dress, attempting to rebuild the wall of intimidation that had always worked before. She leaned forward, her voice a harsh, venomous hiss that carried clearly to the surrounding rows. She demanded to know who allowed me inside the building. She stated with absolute arrogance that the VIP section was strictly reserved for the respected members of the educational community and not a place for negligent parents carrying unresolved debts. She raised her hand, ready to publicly order me out of the auditorium and complete her humiliation of my family. She never finished her sentence. From the heavy velvet curtains on the right side of the stage, two figures emerged into the bright spotlight. The murmurs in the auditorium abruptly died. The audience instantly recognized Mayor Sullivan. Walking slightly ahead of him, projecting an aura of absolute state-level authority, was Chairman Thompson, the head of the State Board of Education. Chairman Thompson did not look at Principal Richard Caldwell, who was still gripping the podium in silent confusion. He did not look at the 400 seated faculty members. He walked directly to the edge of the stage, looked down at the center aisle, and made eye contact with me. He descended the short flight of wooden stairs, bypassed the velvet ropes of the VIP section, and walked straight toward the spot where Brenda and I were standing. Brenda instantly dropped her defensive posture. She smoothed her dress and took a half step forward, plastering a wide, sycophantic smile across her face, fully expecting the chairman to greet the presumptive educator of the year. Chairman Thompson ignored Brenda Gallagher completely. He walked right past her extended hand, stepped directly in front of me, and offered a warm, highly respectful smile. He extended his hand, grasping mine in a firm, professional handshake that signaled equal footing. The collective gasp from the first 3 rows of the auditorium was audible. Sylvia dropped her designer handbag. The heavy leather hit the hardwood floor with a dull thud. Brenda stood frozen, her hands still hovering in the empty air, staring at the chairman of the state board, respectfully greeting the woman she had branded as a destitute failure. Chairman Thompson turned his back on Brenda, walked back up the stairs, and approached the center podium. Richard Caldwell instinctively stepped aside, yielding the microphone to the higher authority. The principal's face was a mask of bewildered panic. He looked down at me, then at the chairman, the gears in his mind grinding desperately to make sense of the scene unfolding in his auditorium. Chairman Thompson gripped the sides of the podium and leaned into the microphone. His voice was deep, resonant, and carried the heavy, undeniable weight of official state business. He welcomed the faculty and the community to the assembly. He stated that before the district proceeded with any localized awards or internal celebrations, the State Board had an urgent and overriding administrative announcement. He declared that the state had been closely monitoring the operational and financial integrity of the Oakridge district for several months. He noted that achieving true educational excellence required absolute transparency, and that the board had determined new, rigorous leadership was immediately required to clean up the administrative framework of the county. Chairman Thompson extended his arm, gesturing directly toward me standing in the center aisle. He announced to the 400 silent people in the room that it was his distinct honor to formally introduce the individual selected by the state to take total executive control of their school system. He asked the audience to welcome the new District Superintendent, Dr. Valerie Thorne. The space inside the massive auditorium instantly froze. The air turned to glass. If absolute profound shock had a physical weight, it would have crushed the front row of the assembly. There was no polite applause. There was no polite coughing. The silence was total, devastating, and suffocating. It was the deafening sound of an entire corrupt hierarchy shattering into a million irreparable pieces. I did not break my posture. I did not look around the room to absorb the shock of the faculty. I slowly turned my head and locked my eyes directly onto Brenda Gallagher. The transformation of her face was a study in absolute terror. The heavy, expensive makeup she had applied for her coronation seemed to physically melt under the sheer heat of her panic. Her eyes were wide, darting frantically around the room, as if searching for an escape route that did not exist. The smug, untouchable queen of Oakridge Elementary realized in one horrifying, paralyzing second that the powerless, impoverished mother she had relentlessly tortured, isolated, and attempted to destroy with Child Protective Services was actually her ultimate superior. She realized she had handed the state's top forensic auditor a personalized roadmap to her extortion ring. Up on the stage, the impact was equally destructive. Richard Caldwell staggered backward. His knees literally buckled, causing his shoulder to slam hard against the wooden side of the podium. He gripped the edge of the wood to keep himself from collapsing onto the stage floor. His mouth opened and closed, struggling to draw oxygen into his lungs. The wealthy, polished principal realized that the woman he had tried to forcefully evict from his district just 3 days ago now held the power to terminate his career with a single signature. The trap I had carefully constructed over the past month had successfully closed. The disguise was discarded. The executioner had officially taken the stage, and the highly anticipated payoff had finally begun. I walked up the short flight of wooden stairs leading to the stage. My heels hit the planks with a sharp, heavy rhythm that commanded the absolute attention of every person in the room. Chairman Thompson stepped back, yielding the center of the stage to me. Richard Caldwell was still gripping the side of the podium, his knuckles stark white, his breathing shallow and rapid. I did not ask him to move. I stepped up to the microphone, forcing him to shrink back into the shadows of the heavy velvet curtain. I adjusted the neck of the microphone. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject an ounce of theatrical anger or triumphant vindication into my tone. I spoke with the freezing mechanical precision of a surgeon reading a terminal diagnosis. I thanked Chairman Thompson for the introduction. I looked out over the 400 silent faces staring up at me. I stated that I had spent the last 30 days operating within their district, living not as an administrator, but as a parent navigating their localized systems. I declared that the purpose of my undercover residency was to conduct a comprehensive ground-level forensic audit of the Oakridge network. I let the word audit hang in the air for a fraction of a second before delivering the killing blow. I informed the assembly that what I had uncovered within their pristine, highly taxed school district was not a culture of elite education. It was a sophisticated, highly organized extortion ring. The collective gasp from the audience was sharp and visceral. The parents in the back rows shifted uncomfortably, realizing that the rumors they had whispered about the new problematic mother were entirely fabricated. I did not break my gaze. I raised my left hand and gestured toward the stage wing. Marcus stepped out from behind the curtain. He wore a flawless, dark-tailored suit, his presence imposing and undeniably professional. He walked to the center of the stage carrying the 5 heavy dossiers bound in thick red cardstock. He placed the binders deliberately onto the polished mahogany display table originally set up to hold Brenda's Educator of the Year award. The heavy thud of the documents hitting the table echoed loudly through the microphone. I gripped the edges of the podium and announced my first official administrative directive as District Superintendent. I stated clearly, ensuring every syllable was recorded by the Assembly's audio system, that effective immediately, Principal Richard Caldwell and Senior Faculty Member Brenda Gallagher were permanently suspended from all educational duties. I announced that I had already filed the formal paperwork with the State Board to initiate the permanent revocation of their teaching and administrative licenses pending a criminal investigation. Down in the VIP section, the sheer shock finally shattered Brenda Gallagher's paralysis. The reality of losing her career, her pension, and her untouchable social status in a matter of seconds caused her to snap. She lunged forward, hitting the velvet rope, her face contorted in a mix of fury and sheer panic. She screamed at the stage, her voice cracking as it echoed through the massive hall. She shrieked that I had no legal authority to execute a suspension without a union hearing. She pointed a shaking finger at me and yelled to the audience that this was a targeted personal vendetta designed to destroy her life over a simple cafeteria misunderstanding. I did not shout back. I reached over to the display table, picked up the top red dossier, and flipped it open to the first tabbed section. I looked down at Brenda and read the facts directly into the microphone. I stated the legal registered name of the EduPay Solutions payment portal. I read the tax identification number aloud. I then read the name of the registered corporate owner, Gregory Peterson, and clearly identified him to the audience as Brenda Gallagher's brother-in-law. The murmurs in the crowd instantly died. The room became deathly quiet as the parents began to realize exactly where their money had been going. I turned the page of the dossier. I detailed the 15% administrative surcharge mechanically applied to every single cafeteria debt field trip fee and extracurricular due, forced through that specific portal. I explained how the administration intentionally utilized public humiliation and the threat of social ostracization to panic parents into processing payments, rapidly generating a massive, unregulated revenue stream. I turned to my left and looked directly at Richard Caldwell, who was now trembling visibly against the velvet curtain. I opened the second tab of the dossier. I announced to the auditorium that EduPay Solutions was shielded by a blinded corporate trust. I read the banking authorization forms aloud, detailing the monthly commission payouts. I stated clearly that the hidden third seat on the corporate board, the seat receiving the direct kickbacks from the extorted processing fees, was legally occupied by Principal Richard Caldwell. I closed the red dossier. The sharp snap of the heavy cardstock shutting echoed like a gunshot. I looked back out at the audience, locking eyes with the horrified parents in the VIP section. I told them that the administration had weaponized their children's basic needs. They had intentionally engineered poverty, leveraged the resulting shame, and utilized the power of their educational positions to directly enrich themselves. The public autopsy of the Oakridge hierarchy was complete. The rot was exposed for everyone to see. The closed red dossier acted as a detonation trigger. The frozen silence of the auditorium shattered, replaced by an escalating roar of collective outrage. 400 people processed the revelation simultaneously. Teachers in the middle rows turned to one another, their faces pale, connecting the sudden mandates for online payments to the offshore accounts I had just detailed. Parents in the back stood up from their chairs, holding their smartphones, recording the stage. The veneer of Oakridge Elementary dissolved into pure chaos. Down in the VIP section, the social hierarchy crumbled. Sylvia, who had spent the last month championing Brenda Gallagher, stared at the teacher with an expression of sheer horror. The realization that her own credit card transactions had funded a localized extortion ring broke her allegiance instantly. The wealthy parents surrounding her began to murmur in disgust, stepping away from the woman they had planned to crown Educator of the Year. Up on the stage, Richard Caldwell realized the walls were closing in. The survival instinct of a cornered bureaucrat kicked in. He stepped out from the shadow of the heavy velvet curtain, his posture hunched, the arrogant swagger entirely gone. Sweat beaded along his hairline, catching the harsh glare of the stage lights. He reached out a trembling hand, attempting to project a facade of reasoned administration. His voice, stripped of its booming confidence, echoed thinly over the sound system. He addressed me by my new title, his tone laced with a desperate, cloying familiarity. He suggested that the complex financial routing I presented was simply a series of unfortunate accounting oversights. He tried to offer a weak, trembling smile. He proposed that we move the discussion into the privacy of the executive boardroom to sort out the ledger discrepancies quietly. He wanted to hide. He wanted to close a door, offer a deal, and preserve whatever fragments of his career remained. I did not lower the microphone. I did not entertain his plea for discretion. I looked down at him and cut off his sentence with a voice as cold and unyielding as a steel blade. I informed the principal that siphoning 15% of cafeteria funds through a hidden holding company could perhaps be argued by a defense attorney as a grievous administrative error. However, I stated clearly, the actions taken by his lead enforcer went far beyond financial misconduct. I turned my attention back to the VIP row, locking my gaze onto the trembling figure of Brenda Gallagher. I addressed the entire auditorium, raising the stakes from theft to psychological warfare. I detailed how Brenda, upon realizing I would not submit to her payment portal, weaponized a state agency. I explained that she filed a malicious anonymous report with Child Protective Services, fabricating allegations of severe neglect to terrorize a 9-year-old child. I let the weight of that truth settle over the room. I stated that using a child welfare agency as a tool for personal retaliation was not an accounting error. I pronounced the final word with deliberate, chilling clarity. It is a felony. The word felony hung in the air for a fraction of a second. As if summoned by the legal term itself, the heavy double doors at the rear of the auditorium swung open. The bright morning light from the lobby spilled into the darkened hall, framing the silhouettes of 3 uniformed police officers. The dull crackle of police radios punctuated the stunned silence of the crowd. The officers stepped into the center aisle. They did not rush. They walked with the measured, inevitable pace of a system coming to collect its due. The heavy tread of their boots echoed against the hardwood floor, a sound that brought the entire room to a standstill. I had coordinated this arrival with Mayor Sullivan hours ago, ensuring the timing aligned perfectly with the conclusion of the public autopsy. The officers bypassed the rear seating and marched directly toward the stage. The lead officer stepped up to the VIP ropes, looking down at the paper warrant in his hand. He called out the names Richard Caldwell and Brenda Gallagher. Brenda collapsed into her chair. Her carefully styled hair fell across her face as she buried her head in her hands, letting out a series of ragged, gasping sobs. She reached out blindly, grasping for Sylvia, seeking the protection of the wealthy parents she had served. Sylvia recoiled. The PTA president physically scrambled backward, pulling her designer skirt away from Brenda's reaching fingers, as if the teacher carried a lethal infection. The rest of the VIP section mirrored the retreat. The affluent mothers who had cheered for Brenda 10 minutes ago now stood in silent judgment, severing their social ties with brutal, instantaneous efficiency. No one offered a single word of defense. They abandoned her the exact moment her power evaporated. 2 officers ascended the stage stairs. They approached Richard Caldwell. He did not resist. He held out his wrists, his eyes staring blankly at the floorboards. The metallic ratcheting sound of the handcuffs locking into place echoed clearly through the microphone I still held. The 3rd officer secured Brenda in the front row. He pulled her to her feet, snapping the steel cuffs securely around her wrists. Her designer silk dress wrinkled and bunched as the officer guided her forward. The officers escorted the principal and the teacher down the exact same center aisle they had intended to use for their victory parade. They walked past the rows of stunned faculty members, past the parents they had extorted, and toward the heavy double doors. The satisfying reality of watching the corrupt architects of Oakridge Elementary leave their own assembly in handcuffs delivered a profound, unparalleled sense of justice. They had built a towering monument to their own vanity, constructed entirely upon the humiliation of vulnerable families. I stood on the stage and watched the heavy doors close behind them, knowing the system of abuse had been effectively thoroughly crushed beneath the weight of undeniable proof. The weeks following the assembly brought a swift, relentless reckoning to the Oakridge School District. The administrative purge did not stop with the arrests of the former principal and the veteran teacher. It extended deep into the operational framework of the county. Marcus took temporary leave from his consulting firm in Chicago to oversee the structural audit of the district ledgers. He dismantled the EduPay Solutions portal line by line, tracing every hidden transaction back to its source. The offshore accounts were frozen by federal authorities within 48 hours of the assembly. Working alongside state regulators, Marcus spearheaded the initiative to issue refund checks to the hundreds of families who had been systematically drained by the processing surcharges. The envelopes arrived in mailboxes across the suburb, serving as tangible proof that the era of extortion was over. The financial web that had trapped so many parents was unraveled and destroyed by a forensic accountant who refused to let a single stolen dollar slip through the cracks. The architects of the extortion ring did not secure bail. The sheer volume of wire fraud charges, coupled with the documented abuse of the Department of Child Protective Services, triggered severe federal indictments. The local news stations broadcast footage of the former principal and the veteran teacher walking into the federal courthouse. They were stripped of their tailored suits and expensive silk dresses, wearing the drab reality of state-issued uniforms. Their carefully curated legacies were reduced to cautionary tales discussed in hushed tones over dinner tables. The impenetrable fortress they had built around themselves crumbled under the weight of basic legal scrutiny. They traded their corner offices and VIP seating for holding cells and court-appointed attorneys. On the following Monday morning, the crisp air felt lighter as I pulled my sedan into the drop-off lane at Oakridge Elementary. I turned off the engine and walked my daughter up the concrete path toward the main entrance. Maya held my hand, her grip steady and secure. The tension that had plagued her steps for the past month was gone. We walked past the reception desk, where the remaining administrative staff offered quiet, nervous greetings, their eyes darting away quickly. They knew who I was now, and they understood the new standard of accountability. We navigated the familiar hallway and approached her fourth-grade classroom. The physical layout of the room had already been corrected. A substitute teacher, a kind woman vetted personally by my office, stood near the chalkboard arranging lesson plans. Maya's desk was no longer banished to the dark corner by the supply closet. The island of reflection had been dismantled and erased. Her chair was positioned right in the center of the front row, integrated seamlessly with her peers. The white cinder block wall she had been forced to stare at was now covered in colorful educational posters. As Maya stepped through the door, a little boy from the neighboring desk rushed over to her. It was the same child Brenda had previously forbidden from speaking to my daughter under threat of severe punishment. The boy reached into his lunchbox, pulled out a chocolate chip cookie, broke it cleanly in half, and offered a piece to Maya. He flashed a bright, gap-toothed smile and asked if she wanted to be lab partners for the upcoming science unit. Maya took the cookie. A bright, genuine smile illuminated her face, erasing the hollow stare that had haunted her for weeks. The cruel isolation was broken, replaced by the simple, resilient grace of childhood. I watched her sit down at her rightful desk, knowing she was safe. I left the classroom and made my way down the main corridor. The morning bell rang, signaling the start of the academic day, but a few parents lingered near the community bulletin board. Among them stood Sylvia and the core members of the Parent-Teacher Association. The dynamic of the hallway shifted the second my heels clicked against the linoleum floor. Sylvia froze in her tracks. The women who had previously turned their shopping carts to avoid me, the mothers who had eagerly participated in the Whisper campaign, now stood rigidly against the metal lockers. The arrogance that used to define their posture was replaced by palpable, suffocating fear. They recognized that the woman walking toward them was not just a parent they had wronged, but the chief executive who controlled the educational destiny of their children. They remembered every exclusionary comment they had posted on their social media forums, and they realized, I possess the authority to audit their PTA fundraising accounts. Sylvia took a hesitant step forward, clutching her designer handbag like a shield. Her face stretched into a tight, fearful grimace that she attempted to pass off as a welcoming smile. She dipped her chin, offering a deferential greeting, her voice trembling slightly as she addressed me by my official title. I did not stop to engage in small talk. I did not demand apologies for the social ostracization or the cruel rumors they had spread. An apology extracted through fear holds no intrinsic value. I did not need their friendship, their validation, or their affection. I only needed them to understand the new boundaries of their environment. I met Sylvia's anxious gaze and offered a single curt nod of acknowledgement. It was a polite, chilling gesture that established an immovable line. I kept walking, leaving the PTA president and her followers standing in silent submission. They understood implicitly that the rules of Oakridge had changed forever, and their reign of social terror was permanently finished. I left the elementary school and drove to the central administrative complex. The executive suite on the top floor awaited me. I walked into the superintendent's office, closed the heavy oak door, and approached the broad mahogany desk. The space was quiet, stripped of Richard Caldwell's personal effects. The shelves were clear, ready for a new foundation built on transparency rather than exploitation. I sat down in the high-backed leather chair. I opened my briefcase and extracted a thick stack of finalized district policies. The top document required my immediate authorization. It was a comprehensive reallocation of the district budget. I picked up my pen and reviewed the figures. The new policy eradicated all third-party payment portals. It mandated that every transaction proceed directly through the secure county treasury without extraneous processing fees. More importantly, the policy established a universal, fully funded lunch program for every student within the Oakridge district, regardless of their family's income bracket, tax bracket, or residency status. I signed my name at the bottom of the page in sharp, decisive ink. I systematically eliminated the exact mechanism that the former administration had used to terrorize my daughter. The red stamp of debt was permanently outlawed. No child in my district would ever be humiliated over a hot meal again. I leaned back in the chair and looked out the window at the sprawling suburban landscape. The process of auditing and dismantling the corrupt system had taken immense patience, tactical precision, and a refusal to react to petty provocations. It required transforming vulnerability into a calculated weapon. The tears I shed 7 years ago in Chicago had not been wasted. They had been refined into the steady resolve that brought down an empire of extortion. I often look back at the young mother shivering on the Chicago pavement. She thought the world was an immovable mountain of rules designed to crush her. Today, sitting in the superintendent's office overlooking the district I rebuilt, I know the truth. Mountains can be leveled. You just need to know exactly where to place the dynamite. The destruction of Richard Caldwell and Brenda Gallagher was not a stroke of luck. It was the result of a calculated methodology. If you are currently standing in the shadow of a system that makes you feel powerless, I want you to take 3 lessons from my experience. First, never hand your opponent the weapon of your own emotional reaction. Bullies thrive on the panic they create. They want you to scream, to cry, and to act erratically so they can label you unstable and dismiss your grievances. When you are under attack, your greatest asset is a cold, unbreakable silence. Do not argue with a tyrant. Let them boast and let them leave a paper trail. Document every interaction. Save every email. Track every dollar. Your quiet compliance is often the exact camouflage you need to gather the evidence that will eventually secure their downfall. Second, recognize that authority is frequently an illusion maintained by collective fear. The affluent parents of Oakridge allowed a teacher to extort them because they were terrified of social ostracization. The principal's power relied entirely on his polished reputation. But a title does not grant invincibility. People who abuse their positions become arrogant, sloppy, and blind to their own vulnerabilities. Once you expose the greed hiding behind their prestigious labels, the community's blind allegiance will fracture, and their social hierarchy will collapse under its own weight. Third, understand the fundamental difference between petty retaliation and true justice. Getting a single educator fired might have satisfied a temporary urge for payback, but it would have left the financial extortion ring intact to victimize the next vulnerable family. True protection requires you to aim higher. You must dismantle the architecture that allowed the abuse to occur in the first place. You do not just remove the bad actors. You rewrite the district's policies, sever the illicit funding streams, and change the bylaws so the damage can never be repeated. You secure the foundation so no one else ever has to fight the same war. My name is Valerie Thorne, and I learned how to rewrite the rules. You possess the exact same capability to take control of your own narrative. Do not let anyone stamp a label on your worth. If you found strength in my journey, please share your own experiences in the comments below. Hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and keep tuning in to Hazel Tells Stories for more narratives about reclaiming your power. Remember, the quietest person in the room is usually the one holding all the cards.